My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking at characteristics of living things. Now, that's kind of important, and I can tell you as a firsthand experience. I like to work in my backyard and in my front yard sometimes. Sometimes I see foreign objects that might be laying around and might not be able to see exactly what they are. And the first thing I start trying to decide is whether it might be alive or maybe it's not alive. And so I'll focus on the observation. Two things I'll look for. First thing, I'm going to look to see if it's moving. The second thing, I'm going to see if it's expanding or growing any. And most people, that's what they kind of look at to see if something that they can't decide whether it's living or not, they'll use that. But it goes further than that. For example, I've got a rock here. Now we know, and you know, that this rock is not alive, right? It's not a living thing, simply because you know it's a rock. It's not going to move, and it's not going to grow. So we can use those two observations to cast and say it's not alive. But there's other things that come into use to decide whether something is living or non-living. Now, you can also say, well, let's see, if it's moving, could it be alive? Well, a car can move down the street, but that car is not alive, is it? Or if you're camping, or maybe you have a fireplace in your house, and you've got a fire going in the fireplace, or maybe a campfire, and you put wood on that fire to make it bigger so it gets warmer. So it makes the fire grow and get bigger. Would that make the fire being alive? No. One of the key characteristics of living things is that it has to have that basic unit of life, or be made up of that basic unit of life. And that basic unit of life, we say, are cells. Now, I've got a little short PowerPoint that I'm going to be showing you. In that PowerPoint, you're going to learn the characteristics of living things, the basic characteristics of living things. Because you see, because it's made up of cells, those cells have a job, whether it's a singular celled organism or a multi-celled organism, those cells have a job. It has to help that living thing go through what we call life processes. Now, because it's going through life processes, that means living things have needs. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Bear with me as I share my screen with you. Living things, wow. Needs of living things. One thing that we need to look at when we talk about proper temperature, some animals must keep an internal temperature within a certain range in order to remain alive. Now, this is a very big word for students of your age, but this word is called homeostasis. It is the ability for an organism to keep conditions inside its body the same, regardless of the conditions outside the body. Now, that is likened to this. The average temperature for humans, for people, is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the average temperature that we should be inside of our body. Now, if that temperature goes up, then we're running a fever. That means we're not doing very well. If it goes below that several degrees, then that means we're not doing well either. And one of the things we know that we're dealing with a virus going around. One of the indicators for that virus is if we're running a fever, that means we possibly could be testing positive for the COVID, the virus that's going around that we're having a problem with now. So any change in temperature that is not our average, we know something is wrong. It is the ability to maintain that internal temperature and conditions inside of us that is one of the characteristics of living things. Now, again, the average temperature for us is 98.6 degrees. And we have adaptations that help us to maintain that constant body temperature. Some of the adaptations are what we call artificial adaptations. If it got very, very cold outside, we would dress for that. Of course, animals, they have adaptations too, like fur covering their bodies, and that keeps them warm and enables them to keep their body temperatures up also. And mammals, all mammals or most mammals have fur or hair covering parts or most of their bodies. Now, on the other hand, reptiles are considered to be cold-blooded. And what does that mean? That means that the temperature around them, the environment around them is very, it makes their temperature vary. For example, the alligator that we see in this image right here, if it's cold water that he's laying in, or if the air around him is cold, guess what? His inside body temperature is going to match the temperature of the water and the air. And sometimes that can be good, sometimes it can be bad. Because if it gets too cold, it's going to affect the other life processes that his body has to go through so that he can stay alive. So most of the time, if an alligator or a member of the reptile family, which they're all cold-blooded, in the winter months when it gets cold, to protect themselves, they go into a deep hibernation, a deep sleep. They go dormant. And then when spring comes and it warms up, then they come out of that deep sleep. They come out of that hibernation because now their bodies can be warm and the rest of their life process functions can become normal again. Mammals, which humans are members of that group, we're considered to be warm-blooded. So we do have the advantage of staying warm all the time because of the adaptations that we have, even the extra adaptations that humans can have by dressing warm enough to deal with cold weather. Are there any advantages of being cold-blooded? Well, I'm not so sure about that because I am not cold-blooded, but I'm sure there are. Going into that deep sleep, that protects them. Now, we don't go into that deep sleep. Before reptiles go into a deep sleep, I'm sure that they're out getting enough food and nutrients so that their life processes can actually continue while they're hibernating. Energy is something else that living things need. Now, that rock that I showed you earlier, does it need energy? No, because that rock is just going to be laying around doing nothing. Every living thing needs energy. All energy comes from the ultimate energy source that we call our sun. Now, without the sun, life on our planet could not and would not exist. Consumers are organisms that obtain their energy from eating plants and other animals. So humans or people, we are considered to be consumers because we consume other things, right? In the images, you see a dinosaur and you also see an insect eating another type of insect. With consumers, there's a little saying, eat or be eaten. Producers are organisms that can make their own food. So they do have needs also because they need several things that they use to make their own food. They need sunlight, which is, again, the ultimate source of energy for our life on our planet and the planet Earth. And they need water, and they also need carbon dioxide, which we breathe out. Food and water is a necessity so that organisms, living things, can go through their life processes. The ability to convert that food into energy, it's sort of like a type of metabolism, okay? And living things have to be able to do that, converting food into energy. Now, water. The human body is usually composed of 65% water. And I'll tell you another little secret. The blood that flows through our veins, guess what? A big part, a very large part of that blood is water. In fact, 92% of our blood is actually water. Oxygen is another necessity. Oxygen is necessary for respiration. That is another characteristic of living things. Being able to breathe in some sort. We call that respiration. Space is another aspect. There's something else that living things need. Some living things don't need very much. Others need a great deal. For example, the deer that's in the image. And we have space that we live in, our houses. What happens if you don't have enough space in which to live? Well, have you ever heard of carrying capacity? If you haven't, then you will learn in the upper grades that when you get too crowded, there's a shortage of food, which we know that that food is a necessary characteristic. Eating food is a necessary characteristic that living things have to get energy, right? So certain places where living things live, there must be enough space for those living things. And we call that carrying capacity. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen with you, and I'm going to get out a few live organisms to show you guys, and we'll talk about the characteristics they have. You know, growing is another characteristic that living things need. And you heard me talk about metabolizing, taking food and changing that food as they consume it into energy. Well, guess what? There's a waste product that comes from that. For example, what we consume, the body's going to use part of that for energy, but part of that is going to be waste that our bodies and living things' bodies will have to get rid of. And we call that excretion, getting rid of body waste. Okay? Now, here I have a plant. This plant has gone through what living things go through constantly. It's a survivor. This plant, because it's a plant, produces its own food through photosynthesis, taking in sunlight, carbon dioxide, and a little bit of water, and it's making its own food. Well, guess what? It's very sensitive to the environment. In fact, when we had the big freeze from the polar vortex, guess what? I had two plants in this pot and they were in my greenhouse. This one on this side died. This one struggled and made it through. It was very sensitive to the environmental changes that were going on around it. And I have clipped off the dead part and I'm hoping this one comes back. Now, this is a plant. Does it affect animals? I'm sure it does. If you were here visiting us today and we took a trip into the Post-Oak Preserve, I would be looking for a little animal that looks like this. This is a three-toed box turtle. And of course, it's alive. It's a living thing. It's made up of cells. So is the plant that I showed you. It's made up of cells. And those same cells make up certain types of tissues. The same tissues make up certain parts of the animal that we call organs. And the same organs that are in an area that do a life process functioning, we call that an organ system. So cells are the beginning of living things. Now, Teresa here, she's a multi-celled animal, okay? She's got legs, she's got a head, got a little stubby tail back there too. And we have these in the Post-Oak Preserve. And if we were walking the preserve today, I would be looking for little turtles like Teresa. Now, Teresa she's very sensitive to the environment. And if it got real cold, like during the winter months, and she was in the preserve, she would go into that deep sleep that I was telling you about with the alligator, because she is a reptile also. Okay, that's Teresa. Got another little animal that I want to show you, and it's alive too. This is Hoppy the bullfrog. Now, Hoppy the bullfrog, he's alive. We see that he's moving, so we're getting motion, okay? But he is made up of cells also. And he goes through those life processes that you heard me talking about, okay? He's going to grow. Probably won't grow much more because he is an adult. And Teresa won't grow much more either. So that's Hoppy. Hoppy the American bullfrog. Now, both those animals, guess what? They're also going to do something that other living things do. And you'll hear a little more talk about that as you spend time on our virtual field trip. They're going to reproduce. Now, Hoppy's a male. So for his frogs or those frogs to reproduce, it must be a female involved. And that female will lay eggs, okay? Teresa's a female, so she does have the ability to lay eggs. And one of the other teachers is going to share a little bit more about that with you later on in the virtual field trip. So we can kind of see that living things have needs and they have certain characteristics, and it all comes down to living things have to go through life processes.